All right. Wow, this has already been a crazy day. This is July 20th at 10 o'clock in the morning. This is History 181. I had my power go out 20 minutes into my 9 o'clock class. And so everything went black for them. For me, everything went black. I was sitting down here in the dark. So I had to create a second video just for them for their second half of their class. So hopefully that won't happen to us. I guess it's just a remnant of the storm last night. We lost our electricity about 4 times last night. And when I came down here this morning, it had happened again during the night, and my computer was dead as a doornail, and our internet was out because the electricity was out. So I had to wait just now until until our internet, our modem, came back up. But anyway, hopefully we'll make it through this hour without interruption. So this is History 181. Let me bring up the syllabus to see what we're doing and where we are. All right, so I'll bring this over here for you guys. Let me do the share screen thing. Okay. All right, so let's see where we are. We'll be getting our 2 quizzes, the first of our 2 quizzes soon. I realize it's getting awfully late to do it, but they usually go in the last quarter of the semester. So let's see. This is July 20th. So you just took exam 2, and if you haven't gotten your completed grade for it yet, you will very soon. I'll be grading any of them that are left this afternoon in my office hours. So you'll see that grade pop up there. You should have exam 3 popping up available for you after this class. When this class is over at 11 o'clock, exam 3 will pop up. It will cover World War II. Remember, the last one stopped with Pearl Harbor. Boom. So this exam will cover all of World War II, United States and World War II, Europe and the Pacific, the origins of the Cold War, and the Korean War. So today we need to go over the Korean War for sure, because that'll be on the test today. Now remember, it goes up at 11 o'clock today. If you feel like you're ready, then go for it. It will be available to you for a week. So when we come back and have this conversation a week from today, it'll still be available until the end of the day. I believe you have until midnight a week from today, starting at 11 o'clock today. But we'll go over the Korean War in just a minute. That's the last thing that'll be on the test that starts today. And then we'll get into America 1945 to 60 and the space program, which will be the first 2 things on your final exam. Remember, your final exam will cover from part 12 to the end only. Your writing assignment is due by midnight a week from today. So don't forget about that. And then we'll have a couple of little quizzes popping up here, a couple of them. They are going to be basically video quizzes where you watch a short video on YouTube and then answer like 5 or 10 multiple choice questions. They're not strenuous, they're not huge, but it gives you a good chunk of 50 points each, 2 of them. In fact, I'll probably post those this afternoon as well. And what I tend to do with the video quizzes is I give you longer, right? I give you, because you have to have time to watch it and do the quiz. And you can do them simultaneously. I don't care. Like you can have the video on while you're taking, if it'll let you, while you're taking the quiz. I have no problem with that at all. I just want you to watch the video and kind of take stuff from it. And so if you're doing it at the same time as the quiz, that's fine. But I'm trying to think. There was one other thing I wanted to mention about that. Oh, there's 2 of them. I may put at least one of them up this afternoon, but I tend to give you like a couple of weeks on it. So they'll probably be available till almost the end of the summer term, which is not long. It's 2.5 weeks, I guess. We got 1 more class, 2 more classes, and then the last few days. So yeah, a little over 2 weeks. And by the way, don't forget to register for fall. I think we're going to be trying to do it on campus. There may be some mix where half the students come someday and half the students come the other day. We're still kind of, I think the college is still working out what's going to work. We're kind of in flux because I just saw in the news that they've redivided the state of Illinois up, and our new area is not doing so well. So we may have additional restrictions imposed on us. That would not be good. Okay, so first thing is first, let's get through the Korean War, and then we'll go from there. So this is the last thing that will be on the exam that goes up today. So the thing I always try to emphasize about the Korean War is not the battles or anything so much. They're not that exciting. It's, I guess if you were in them, they were exciting, but otherwise not so much to learn about. But the thing that's significant about the Korean War is its place within the Cold War, you know, within the context of the Cold War. And the way that we conducted it offers some lessons, okay? So here's what happened. Japan was defeated in World War II, and they had captured the entire north and south part of Korea. Japan had invaded the whole thing. So when they lost, they were pushed out. The northern part followed Russia's example and became communist and tried to have a communist government in Pyongyang. The southern part followed the American example and tried to have a non-communist government in Seoul. And so the sort of the dividing line between the Russian-backed area and the American-backed area was the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel. It was not an international border yet. It just divided the communist part from the non-communist part, as we all worked together to try to determine what kind of government Korea would have going forward. It's being kind of weird, sorry. Well, I'll come back to that map. So the war itself, how did it start? Well, it's controversial. Some say that Stalin in the Soviet Union, the Russian, leader, ordered it. Others say the Chinese urged it because, let's look at the dates. Okay, World War II ended in 1945. But by 1949, remember, China had become communist with Chairman Mao. And so some said, well, look at the map. China was now communist, and they didn't want American military forces on their border, which we know is true to this day. The Chinese don't want American military forces on their border. That would be a threat as they see it. So the Chinese wanted the North Korean communists to at least be here and possibly the entire peninsula just to keep the United States away. So if it wasn't the Russians, then maybe it was the Chinese. Or maybe North Korea just said, like, we're going to invade the South and conquer the whole peninsula for ourselves. We don't know. I don't know why PowerPoint's being weird either. But in any case, on June 25th, 1950, the North Korean communists came flying across the 38th parallel and attacked the South Koreans and the Americans and pushed the South Korean and American forces all the way down to what was called the Pusan perimeter. Pusan perimeter. So in other words, the United States and the South Korean military were hanging on by a fingernail as the communists were conquering the entire country. And here are the refugees fleeing the communists. And so the United States went to the UN, and you might say, well, why would we go to the UN? Well, because we had just created the UN 5 years earlier. Remember, the United Nations was one of the things that came out of World War II and was supposed to be this great futuristic development, a place to go and talk about these things rather than fighting. And it was a collective security arrangement. So the United States went to the UN and said, look, South Korea has been attacked by North Korea. Here's one complication, though. They were not separate countries. There was just Korea. And one of the rules in the UN is the United Nations cannot get involved in an internal civil war. The UN can only get involved when country A attacks country B. That's collective security, right? If country A is having a fight inside itself, the UN can't get involved in that. So the United States is like, we're frustrated by the fact that Korea is seen as one country. What we need is for Korea to be two countries so that we can then say that Korea A attacked Korea B and we need to rescue Korea B. So the U.S. starts presenting it that way. Well, South Korea is really a separate country and they were attacked by that other country of North Korea. the Soviets and the Chinese both would have objected to that and said, no, 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 that's not how it is. But fortunately for the United States and South Korea, there was no Soviet or Chinese representative in the Security Council that day. They were boycotting. Again, it gets kind of complicated, but as best I can explain it quickly, when the Security Council of the UN was created, Communist China didn't exist. It was that non-communist Chinese government. Well, by 1950 now, that non-communist Chinese government has gotten pushed all the way to Taiwan. So the government of China, recognized by the UN in 1950 when the Korean War happens, was Taiwan, not Beijing. So the Taiwanese voted with the US as our buddies. The Beijing communist government didn't have a place at the UN. They were not recognized as the legitimate government of China yet. The Russians were their buddies, and they were mad about that. So the Russians were boycotting the UN, and so there was no Soviet and there was no communist Chinese representative there to veto. So there was no veto. So by a vote of like 4-0 with one not voting, Russia, the Korean War was authorized by the UN. So President Truman looks around and says, who can I put in charge? Well, the general that really knows his way around the Pacific and Asia is General Douglas MacArthur, right? He had liberated the Philippines and gone on to defeat Japan. Let's bring him out of retirement and send him over to go up against the North Koreans. And so he leads a United Nations force, but it was mostly Americans, as you might guess, right, against the North Korean communists. And he does this really brilliant landing at Incheon, kind of like D-Day all over again, lands behind the North Korean lines where they weren't expecting it. And so, let me blow this up a little bit so you can see it better. So between the U.S. UN forces landing at Pusan and the U.S. UN forces landing at Incheon, together they pushed the North Korean communists all the way up to the border with China. The yellow part here is where so remember, the North Koreans had been all the way down to here. All of this had been communist, and the American and South Korean were that. Now it's completely flipped the other way. I always say the Korean War is like wind sprints up and down the peninsula. They go up and down, up and down. Well, now the Americans and the South Koreans chase the communists all the way up to the Chinese border. Now, you can see in a couple of places we even touch the Chinese border there, okay? But here's the thing. The Chinese were now communist and didn't like us very much, and they said, you better stop. Because for one thing, the United Nations had said, yes, United States, you can lead an invasion of attack of North Korea to rescue South Korea, but the UN had said, you can't attack the other country to stop at the 38th parallel. Well, General MacArthur was so excited by his success that he just crossed the 38th parallel and kept going all the way up to there. So we were already in violation of the UN order, which was to liberate South Korea. We were invading North Korea. So the UN said, don't go up into here, and we did. The Chinese said, don't come up on our border, and we did. So you can see we have exceeded the mission statement. We have gone beyond what we were supposed to do. This is called mission creep. It's when your mission is to do A and B, and you do them so well, you go, oh, heck, let's do C and D. Well, now you're getting in dangerous territory because you're doing stuff that wasn't planned and wasn't allowed and wasn't supposed to happen. But, of course, we're Americans, so we go, well, we can do whatever we want. We don't have to listen to the UN. We're already getting that attitude, which makes all the other countries mad at us because they think we're too good, right, too big. So we are violating the rules. We go all the way up to the border of China. There's the landings in Incheon that did really well. We pushed them all the way back up. Yeah, there's another view of how far up we got. Big victories for MacArthur. He looks like a genius. And there's the landings. Look a lot like D-Day. Now, we pause at this point for a couple of questions because it seems like everything's going great at this point. And it kind of was, but we were starting to exceed our mission statement. So should we stop or keep going? Well, MacArthur says, heck yeah, we're going to keep going all the way to China. Well, what are the war aims? Why are we in this fight? Remember, without the Cold War, we wouldn't have even cared about a civil war in Korea. Why would we care? But because it's communism against non-communism, suddenly we care a lot, right? So we got to go help the South Koreans. So what is the goal? Is the goal to liberate South Korea? Is the goal to get rid of communism in all of Korea? Why stop there? Why not invade China? We don't like China being communist. Why stop there? Let's bomb Moscow. World War III, nuclear weapons. So you kind of have to know going into a war where the finish line is. Where's the goalpost? And don't keep moving the goal line further back, right? Figure out where the goalposts are. How do you define? It's the same thing. How do you define victory? When do you win in Korea and when do you not? Capturing the South? Capturing the North? I don't know. Let me re-up the audio just to make sure. Define victory. We hadn't decided that yet, and that's a bad thing because when you go into a war, you need to state up front, here is how we win and what we need to do. So one lesson of Korea is simple. Define your goal in advance of a war and then stop when you achieve it. Don't go, hey, we're doing great, let's go do something else. No, just stop. Stop when you get there. So we didn't. General MacArthur kept going. He crossed the 38th parallel and kept going north. China says, you don't want to be up here. And we thought, oh, what's China going to do? They ain't going to do anything. So we ignored them. And we got to the Yalu River, that border with China, by October 25th. This is just, we're still in 1950. On the evening of November 25th, 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River and attacked the American, UN, and South Korean forces. For several hours, we didn't know it was the Chinese, and our soldiers were like, our commanders were like, where are all these North Koreans coming from? Where did they find all these North Koreans suddenly? And then after a while, we realized, uh-oh, those aren't North Koreans. We are suddenly in a war with the biggest country on earth, a country that could march its army into the sea and never run out of soldiers. So the U.S. UN forces, here goes the wind sprint back down the peninsula, back to below Seoul. And MacArthur goes on television and radio and says, we are now facing an entirely new war, a war with China, basically. And so there's, at least we didn't get all the way down to Busan this time, but still, that's not very good. We've lost the capital, we've lost the 30th parallel, and the communists are all the way down to here. In fact, excuse me, the hiccups. Many UN troops had to evacuate by water to get back down. God, I got the hiccups, excuse me. Well, oh shoot, I did the thing where I clicked on it by accident. Okay, hold on. I really got to quit doing that. All right. So where they had been big buddies before, oh, got the hiccups. I'm just going to make it through this. Sorry. Where they'd been big buddies before, General MacArthur is now called in by Truman, who fires him for insubordination, right? In other words, he's doing his own thing, making his own rules, and not obeying the president. And one thing we know in our country is we are required by our Constitution to have civilian control of the military. There always has to be a civilian at the top of our military. After all the generals and admirals and everything, there has to be a president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. There's a president at the top who is a civilian. Even if the president used to be a general like Washington or Eisenhower, they still have to be retired. You can't run for president as a general unless you have retired. So Truman had ultimate authority. He fired MacArthur. Public opinion was pro MacArthur overwhelmingly. MacArthur came home, had a huge ticker tape parade in New York. Truman's popularity went in the basement. There had never been a president as unpopular in the last 100 years of polls. There had never been a president whose approval ratings were lower than Truman's when he fired MacArthur, until George W. Bush during the financial crisis of 2008. That's the first time it got beaten, down in the 20s. So from 51 through 53, the war just kind of, there's not a lot to talk about there, just a bunch of battles. You can watch MASH and see the outcome, all the wounded and dying and dead. And it was kind of a stalemate at that midpoint. And there's the people that were massacred. The communists were not good people. In 1953, after a meat grinder has ground on for 2 or 3 years, they agree to a ceasefire and armistice. The 38th parallel becomes more or less the actual border between a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, between a new North Korea and a new South Korea. It's 2 separate countries. 4 kilometer wide. You see it in if you've ever watched the James Bond movie Die Another Day, the last Pierce Brosnan one with Halle Berry. You see James Bond in a battle running through the DMZ, which is pretty cool. U.S. forces are still at the DMZ watching the North Koreans to this day because we always think they're up to something, and they usually are. And there were 54,200 U.S. casualties in Korea, and almost as many as in Vietnam, but just in 3 years instead of 8. And there's where they ended up with that green line there, the DMZ. The capital of the north is Pyongyang, capital of the south is Seoul. Excuse me, is Seoul. So today, North Korea is an impoverished, hostile country that we don't get along with, except for President Trump. And they have few friends except for the president. They have a nuclear weapons program, which is scary. While South Korea, of course, is cranking out Samsung and Hyundai and all kinds of consumer electronics that we like. They are a modern, prosperous nation, but they're scared to death of their crazy cousins to the north. They are a U.S. ally, more or less. All right, and there's the DMZ. All right, so that, my friends, is where the third exam ends. The exam that will cover World War II, the origins of the Cold War, and the Korean War. That exam will post in about 45 minutes on Blackboard. You can take it today. You can take it tomorrow. You can take it all the way through a week from today if you want to, whenever you feel like it. It's just, I think, 20 or 25. It says on there, but it's either 20 or 25 multiple choice questions. All right, now we're going to go ahead and get into America 45 to 60 and the space program. This will be on the final exam. So draw a line here. This is on the final exam, not on the exam today. And when I say today, I mean starting today, this week. Okay, so World War II is over. We're back home now domestically. The post-war, I'm going to have to go pretty quickly through all of this to get it all in. But again, you can always rewind, watch it again, or you read your textbook, you got your PowerPoints. So I'm going to zip right along through this. Here we go. Post-war economy in the United States was unprecedented growth. America was a modern industry and technology, and partially because the war had blown up all of our competitors. Imagine that you own a restaurant in Belleville at a time when there's not a virus, okay? Imagine you own a restaurant in Belleville and every other restaurant blows each other up, sets each other's buildings on fire, kills each other's owners. For a little while, you're going to get a lot of business, aren't you? You're going to make a lot of money because you're the only restaurant left. But guess what? Sooner or later, they're going to rebuild those other restaurants. Either those owners are going to get their insurance payment and build a new one, or new people are going to come in and build new restaurants. You could be the greatest restaurant runner ever. You're going to make a fortune when there's no competition, and you're not going to make as much money when there is competition later. That's the United States during this period. From 1945 to 60, we were the only game in town. If you wanted to buy cars, you bought a Chevy or a Ford or a Chrysler. If you wanted industrial equipment, you bought American industrial equipment, right? Because we were the only game in town. But by 1960, Japan is back, Germany is back, France, Britain, Italy, they're all back, and now we suddenly have competition. Suddenly you could buy a Ferrari, you could buy a Toyota, you could buy a Honda, you could buy a BMW, a Mercedes, right? A Jaguar. It gets a lot harder to be the richest kid in town when there are other kids that also have products to sell. Okay. So the middle class grew while we were making so much money. This is at a time when dad worked, mom could stay home and be just the homemaker. You had lots of kids back then. The baby boom were the kids being born, lots of kids. And dad made enough money for everybody. You did fine. The auto industry was big, the housing industry after the war. The defense industry was huge, and that was a big West Coast industry, California all the way up to Seattle, with Boeing and Raytheon and GE, right, all making tanks and bombs and missiles and all the modern warfare equipment. During this time, America began to move to a service economy. Kind of have to explain this really quickly. There's 3 levels of economy, okay? Again, you might want to rewind this or whatever, but I'll try to run through it as clearly as I can. There's 3 levels of economy. Level 1 is extraction, where you're digging up iron ore out of the ground, you're growing crops. That's primary, extracting stuff from the ground. That was the human world for thousands and thousands of years. Level 2, secondary, is manufacturing, where, starting with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, you start building stuff. You build plows and swords, you build tractors, you build cars, right? You build stuff. That's the second level. America kicked butt at that second level economy, but we started having competition as Britain, as Germany, as Japan got good at building stuff too, right? In fact, the British were ahead of us at it with the Industrial Revolution. Well, after World War II, we enter into that third level economy, which is service. If the commodity, the stuff, right, of the first level is raw materials, crops, iron ore, coal, the stuff, the commodity of level 1 is raw materials. The commodity of level 2 is a manufactured product. Look at my new tractor I built. Would you like to buy it? Look at my new Chevy I built. Would you like to buy it? Okay, manufactured goods. So what's the commodity of level 3 service? The commodity, the stuff, is information and knowledge. So you can see where eventually the internet becomes this massive service economy tool. We're using it right now, right? Because I don't dig up iron ore in a mine, and I don't work in a car manufacturing plant. I work in the service economy as a teacher, as a professor. And so anything that moves information around more efficiently is good for me, like the internet, you see? So but not just that, medicine, technology, entertainment, it's all information. Think about if you want to watch a movie, it comes to your house through your cable and it's Netflix or something. And so it's just ones and zeros. I've always said, Hollywood today, their job is to put ones and zeros in just the right order that you get a Star Wars movie or a Taylor Swift album. It's just ones and zeros in a particular order for the computer to read it and produce a movie, to show you a movie or to let you listen to music or whatever, or this video. All right, let's see. So we're moving toward a service economy as far back as the 1940s, and today we are overwhelmingly a service economy. Even if you work in like insurance or medicine or banking, if you're sitting behind a desk using a computer, you're probably somehow in the service economy. The Sun Belt, which is like the southern part of the U.S. all the way over to California, grew tremendously. Before 1945, the biggest part of the United States was the Northeast and the Midwest. Now it becomes the Sun Belt. These 4 states grow tremendously during this time. Los Angeles goes from being a small city to being the second largest city behind only New York. It passes Chicago. Suburbs become a huge thing, and people begin to shop in a different way. Shopping centers pop up instead of small town stores. Eventually you'll get malls, and the fast food industry is born because now people all have cars after World War II. So McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and all of that grow up, and Kentucky Fried Chicken all grow up as a reaction to the car culture that develops after World War II. So we needed more highways, and we developed the interstate highway system. Franklin Roosevelt had wanted this and was working on it during the 30s and 40s, kind of got distracted by the war. And then President Eisenhower picked it up in the 50s, and we start getting our modern interstate highway system. You also have television in 3/4 of U.S. homes by 1960. Television was invented at the very end of World War II by a number of different people working in different places that kind of developed the technology at the same time. The American who contributed the most to the invention of television, you never heard of him. You've heard of Alexander Graham Bell on the telephone. Why have you never heard of the guy that really invented the television? I don't know. He had a funny name. His name was Philo Farnsworth. But Philo Farnsworth should be as famous as Alexander Graham Bell, in my opinion, or Morse or Marconi, because he largely developed American television, and it took off in a huge way. Here's the interstate highways that developed very quickly. If I had time, I would go into more detail on that, but you might find it boring, but I don't really have time. And here's if you took our interstates and made a subway map out of it. I just thought that was kind of cool. It just shows how all of them are connected together. And St. Louis is kind of a hub, just like Atlanta and other places. You got Miami down here, Seattle, Bellingham, Washington up there, San Diego down here, just about what you'd expect, Maine. Okay, in 1951, we get, let me back up. When the scientists developed the atomic bomb, they knew it would be possible to make a much bigger bomb. They just had to develop it. And it didn't take but 6 years to develop the super bomb called the hydrogen bomb or the H bomb. This is truly a nuke, a nuclear weapon rather than an atomic weapon. Remember, atomic weapons take a big clumpy atom or take a bunch of big clumpy atoms and rip them apart, like uranium is ripped apart or plutonium is ripped apart and releases all that energy. That's called fission. You're tearing a big clumpy atom apart and releasing all that energy as an explosion. A hydrogen bomb does kind of the opposite. A hydrogen bomb uses an atomic bomb as like the trigger to set off a super hot, high pressure blast that compresses hydrogen and creates a fusion reaction. Now, where else in nature do you find a hydrogen compressed into helium fusion reaction going on? The sun. So when we set off a hydrogen bomb, you are essentially taking the sun and setting it on your enemy there for a little while. Here, have the sun, enjoy. Because the sun is a giant hydrogen bomb that has been going off for 3 billion years and will continue to go off for like 3 billion more years. And so we figured out how the sun worked and then made one that we could drop on our enemies. Oh boy. And there's the gigantic mushroom cloud you get from testing a hydrogen bomb. All the radioactive deadly poisons that are then drifted down over the islands and over the oceans, and we get to drink them in our water, yay. Here are battleships that the Navy parked around this island and set off a hydrogen bomb. You can see how that went. There was nobody on them. They just wanted to see what happened. What happened was all the ships became intensely radioactive and had to be destroyed. By the way, the island that they blew up here in the Pacific was called Bikini Atoll. Atoll is like a little tiny island. The same week that we nuked Bikini Atoll, that same week, the fashion industry came out with the modern two-piece women's swimsuit. And they needed a name for it. And they said, wow, it's hot as fire, that swimsuit. We will call it the Bikini. So the Bikini is named after the island we had just nuked with a hydrogen bomb. It's the truth. Can't make it up. So the fair deal. You'll remember that Teddy Roosevelt had the square deal. FDR had the New Deal. And so Truman, kind of carrying on that tradition, he lays out as the president now the fair deal, which was his domestic program during his presidency. And it included famously the GI Bill. The GI Bill was a law that said that returning servicemen coming home from World War II would have access to loans to buy a nice house, and they would have access to funds for their college educations. And so lots and lots of servicemen came home. Really weren't that many servicewomen. Servicemen came home, got a good college education, and became the middle class of the 1950s and 60s, giving birth to the baby boom generation. Truman also banned segregation in the military. He said, I'm just going to sign an executive order and say that we will no longer have a racially segregated military. So I don't know if Congress would have ever done it. They were too scared of their voters. Truman's like, vote against me then. That's fine. I'm going to do it. So in 1948, Truman runs for his own term as president, and he was considered he had no chance. Here's where his popularity was right before the election, down below 40%, right? no president has ever been reelected below 50% approval. And Truman was down here in the 30s. But right before the election was in November of 48, which would have been right here, and you can see that right before the election, his popularity went up before going back down again. George W. Bush's was very similar to this. And so it's funny, everybody thought he was going to lose to Dewey, the Republican candidate Dewey, but at the last minute, Truman's popularity surged. He upset Dewey, and they had already printed newspapers. The Chicago newspaper had already been printed saying Dewey defeats Truman, and he just thought that was hilarious. And so this is a picture taken actually at St. Louis's train station, Union Station, with the president holding up the false, the false newspaper headline. So he's reelected. Well, he wasn't elected the first time, but he's elected for a second term. But his popularity quickly declines, mostly because of the Korean War that we just talked about. So there's the election of 48. And the one interesting thing about it, you can see that Harry Truman is in blue, Dewey is in red. But one interesting thing about it is these yellow states voted for Strom Thurmond, who was like the super racist candidate. What had happened was the Democrats were becoming already, well, I think my audio may be messing up. Let me just check here. Give me a second. Okay, the Democrats were already becoming an African-American welcoming party, and the Deep South didn't like that they were anti-discrimination and pro-civil rights, and so they didn't want to be Republicans, but they didn't want to be these new Democrats, so they went for a third option and went for like the most racist guy they could find, Strom Thurmond, but he didn't do well, and of course Truman won. In 1952, General Eisenhower decides to run, and he didn't really know what party he was. He decided he was a Republican, and he wins, of course, overwhelmingly. And we get 8 years of a Republican president for a change. It had been a while. You had to go back to Hoover, I guess, for the last Republican president. He talked about dynamic conservatism, which is kind of a contradiction in terms like jumbo shrimp. His vice president was this young Senator Richard Nixon. We'll see him again a few times, you can be sure. And Eisenhower was very popular. He overwhelmingly won the presidency. Remember, the South was still Democratic, but it was a Southern Democratic. So they all voted for Adlai Stevenson somehow, but everywhere else went for Eisenhower. So America during the 50s, this was a time of conformity and uniformity. There's the Happy Days crowd. The traditional roles returned. Remember, women had been in the factories and the workforce during World War II. African Americans had more opportunities during World War II because all the men were off, white men particularly, were off fighting. And so now it's like trying to put everything back in, put the genie back in the bottle, put the toothpaste back in the tube. It's not going to work too well. I always say, right, the 50s were the decade that America tried to put everything back where it had been. The women need to be back in the kitchen, getting married, having babies, and cooking. And African Americans needed to know their place, quote unquote, right? And for about a decade, America tried to do that. And in the 60s, boom, right? The 60s are the reaction decade to that. The Beat Generation was an early version of like the hippies. I'm going to zip along here. They rebelled against conventional values. They were just basically like early hippies. That's all I'll say. Elvis during this time comes along and begins to popularize African-American music and culture because, the young white kids there, they really weren't going to listen to black musicians like everyone does today, of course. So you needed somebody to be kind of like the ambassador for African-American culture, and it was largely Elvis. And, there's a certain amount of resentment toward Elvis that he kind of got the popularity that really should have gone to people like Little Richard and other African-American musicians of that era that he kind of was copying. But, he was certainly huge. Greater integration of American culture because of that. The civil rights movement gets going during these years after World War II, as African-Americans had seen the opportunities they had in Europe and thought, why can't it be that way in America, to get rid of second-class citizenship. And one of the early court cases that started moving us in that direction was the school segregation case of Brown versus Board. This little girl, Little Miss Brown, wanted to go to the same school as the white kids, and she was told no, and she sued. And in this case, the Supreme Court said that you can't separate people racially and call it equal at the same time, because the mere act of separating people is treating some of them unequally from others. Makes perfect sense to me. Everybody knows about Rosa Parks and the famous incident in the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, which is about 35 miles from where I grew up. And this was all I'll always say, look at her picture there. You know, she is rightly a hero, an American hero. But if you look at her expression, this is not a woman that has been scared to death by the police and is terrified that she took this timid little stand and now she's paying the price for it by refusing to get up and let a white man have her seat. She knew exactly what she was doing, right? She's like, I'm going to force the issue. I'm going to refuse to get up and they can arrest me. And she's just sitting there like, yep, I did my part. I did my job. Now let's see what happens. I love that picture because you can just see in her face. There's not a bit of fear. There's not a bit of trepidation there. That's a job well done expression, right? She's like, I did my job. Now let's see what happens. And what happens, of course, is that Martin Luther King becomes the leader of the movement. Sorry, there he is. Originally from Atlanta. He was, he's from, well, there was Burma. Yeah. He's from Atlanta, but he was a minister at at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Montgomery. I've been to that church. The 1956 election, Eisenhower runs for re-election. And again, the Deep South, hey, Missouri, I see you there. The Deep South just still can't bring themselves to vote for a Republican, but otherwise, pretty big win for Eisenhower. Little Rock in 57 was ordered to desegregate their public schools. They refused, the governor refused, and so President Eisenhower ordered the Arkansas National Guard to go to the high schools in Little Rock and at basically gunpoint make the schools let the black kids in. And I look at this picture. Here's this young lady trying to go to school. All she's trying to do is go to school, right? And look at this woman's expression. Look at the hate. And what is the deal there? She's trying to go to school and you're just hating on her. It just makes me sick. And then this is the famous picture of my governor when I was in high school, believe it or not, was still Governor George Wallace. And he had said, I will stand in the schoolhouse door and prevent the University of Alabama from being racially desegregated. And so federal agents here came down to say, here's a federal court order. You have to let them in. And so Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door, read a speech. He had his state troopers with hard hats on because their little cowboy hats didn't look scary enough. He gave them hard hats. And he stood in the schoolhouse door, gave a speech, and then picked up his podium, moved out of the way, and they integrated the University of Alabama. And then here's the lunch counter where young people were black and white. What happened was this was, really before fast food places got big. And so if you wanted to go to lunch from where you were working, you had to go to like Woolworths. It's to the food counter. It's the equivalent today of if you go into Walmart and there's a Subway store, right? Or a Burger King or something inside the store, like the one across from Swick, there's a Subway. This is where you went to get your lunch, and they wouldn't serve African Americans. They wouldn't. And so African-American people would sit there, and white people that were allies, they would sit there and say, I'd like to order. And the waitress would be like, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to take your order. Boss won't let me take your order. Well, I'll just wait. I'll just sit here and take up this seat and prevent you from getting any business from anybody else. And I'll wait until you're ready to take my order. And then like a white person would sit down, and the waitress would be like, oh, I can take your order. No, her first. Take her order first. I'll wait. I'm not going to order until she does. And now the waitress is like, huh. And so people came in, and this is just horrifying, right? I mean, look at the expressions. These are people that they're pouring food over their heads. They're taunting them and making fun of them. And you can just see from her expression, she's like, unbelievable that people could be like this. But they're resolutely standing there. And I'm sure they think they're being very clever and funny by trying to humiliate these people, but they're the ones to me that are being humiliated because they are noble, right? These people here at the lunch counter being noble, they're trying to allow equal access for everybody. And these are the people filled with hate, right? With the racism. All right. So we will actually see more of the civil rights movement when we get into the 60s. But our last stop here, I like to break it up a little bit with something a little less intense and stressful, and that'll be the space race. So let's run through the space race quickly, and that'll be it for this week. The space race was a race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to put the first man in space. Well, the Russians won that race. So to put the first man into orbit of the Earth, well, the Russians won that race. So the United States is like, oh, well, then let's keep moving the goalpost back so that we'll finally win. And so we said, hey, I know. Let's say it's the first person to land on the moon and then come back safely. And the Russians are like, oh, man, that's hard. So the race began when the Soviets put Sputnik, it was like a size of a basketball with antennas sticking out of it. All it did was orbit the Earth and go beep, beep. But that was a communist beep. And so it scared America to death. They're like, if the Russians can put a metal basketball that beeps over our heads, they could put a nuclear bomb over our heads. And it scared America to death. I've read that Sputnik did more to encourage studying science and math in school than anything in American history. Also caused a lot of people to dig bomb shelters in their backyards. And the space race ended when Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, 51 years ago today. I just looked at the calendar. It's July 20th. 51 years ago today. This time last year, we were celebrating. We were at the Science Center, the St. Louis Science Center. They had a big celebration thing all day, had all kind of cool stuff going on. It was really neat. So today it's the 51st anniversary of the first manned moon landing, Apollo 11, with Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. President Kennedy in the early 60s had said, we chose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. We had created NASA. Werner von Braun was a German rocket scientist. He had built missiles for Hitler. We kidnapped him basically at the end of World War II, brought him to the United States to Huntsville, Alabama, put him at the Marshall Space Flight Center at Redstone Arsenal, and had him start building Mercury and then Gemini and then Apollo rockets. Mercury was the first set of rockets we built with human beings aboard them because we had to figure out how they worked and how to do it. They carried one astronaut, John Glenn and Alan Shepard, who orbited the Earth, who first into space and first orbit the Earth. And then we started putting two astronauts in the Gemini. They called it Gemini. We might say Gemini. They said Gemini. And then finally, when we were ready to go to the moon, we developed the Apollo missions, which contained 3 astronauts and could reach the moon. The first Apollo actually caught fire on the launch pad during testing and killed the 3 astronauts. It was terrible. Those were the only astronauts, American astronauts, to die in the space program until the Challenger space shuttle many years later we'll talk about. Apollo 8 was the first one to actually go and orbit the moon and come back on Christmas Eve, 1968. Apollo 9 and 10 got a little, I think 10 was what they called the dress rehearsal for the landing. 10 did everything except actually land because they were studying, how it would work. And then finally, on July 20th, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. 3 astronauts, 2 of them landed. The third, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong landed. Michael Collins stayed on the service module orbiting the moon while the other 2 were down on the surface. Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. Buzz was second. We then spent the next 70, 71, 72 landing. We actually ended up landing a total of 6 Apollo missions on the moon. 13 didn't land because 13 is the one that famously had a blowout halfway there and had to they had to repair their rocket and come back home. Go figure that it was 13 that happened to. 17 in 1972 was the last one to go. It's the only one I remember. I was 4, I guess, and I remember the big parachutes as it came down. And little did I dream that when I was 4 years old watching Apollo 17 come back from the moon, that would be the last time we would go to the moon, and we still haven't gone back. There's the Apollo rocket taking off. We launched several of these. kerosene. Those engines burn kerosene. The upper stages burn liquid oxygen and hydrogen, but that lower stage was just so brutal. So it needed so much lifting power. It burned raw kerosene. And there's either Neil or Buzz being photographed by either Neil or Buzz. And people say, well, how is the flag flying? Well, because they used incredibly advanced stick technology. There's a shower curtain rod type thing there holding the flag. Duh. And there's outside the lunar vehicle, and they're setting up. How do we know they went to the moon? Well, A, they set up these laser reflectors, and if you have a powerful laser today and you aim it at the Apollo 11 launch site, you can bounce the beam off these off the laser and measure the vibration of the moon. The moon is still vibrating from all the meteorites that hit it over millions of years. Also, if you get a powerful enough telescope, you can look at where the 6 lunar landers are sitting. We can see them through a telescope. If you go to the St. Louis Science Center, they have big pictures on the walls of that tunnel connecting the 2 buildings that show the 6 modules sitting on the surface of the moon. I always say it's not that complicated. We didn't have to build a hyperdrive like the Millennium Falcon to go to the moon. The moon is not that far away. The moon is slightly farther away than Tokyo, honestly. In fact, if you go out at night or sometimes during the day, you can see it right up there in the sky. All we had to do was light enough kerosene on fire to throw 3 people at it and then push them back. It took a lot less fuel to come back because there's less gravity coming back. It's not that complicated. I don't know why people think that it had to be faked. It would have probably back then, the way that special effects were back then, it would probably cost more money and been more work to fake it than to just go, which we did. We went. Here's the plaque that they left. I would pay tax money to get that removed because after John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson did everything they did to get us there, they landed a few months after Richard Nixon took over. And so Richard Nixon's name is on the surface of the moon, and that ticks me off. There's an astronaut. Okay, after that, we couldn't figure out what to do next for a while, so we developed the space shuttle. It would be reusable. We kept thinking, man, we keep dumping all these pieces of the big Apollo rockets into the ocean where they sink and we never see them again. We need a space vehicle that can take off like a rocket and land like an airplane. So from 1981 to 2011, we used the space shuttle. And most of the time it worked okay. It had a big fuel tank, the big orange thing. They didn't want to just keep repainting it every time they fished it out of the water. So they just left it unpainted after the first few missions. But that's the fuel tank. The fuel from this tank went into the shuttle for these shuttle engines here. These are solid boosters, like big Roman candles just strapped onto the side of the fuel tank. So the shuttle's engines lift the shuttle. But it takes so much fuel for the shuttle to lift itself that the tank is bigger than the shuttle. So the shuttle cannot lift its own fuel tank. So you put rockets on the fuel tank to lift the fuel tank. Crazy. When I was a kid, they rolled this thing out and said, yes, the shuttle is attached to a giant fuel tank and we've strapped these Roman candles on the side of it. And I said, oh my gosh, it's the Hindenburg again. And people are like, no, it's not going to blow up. It blew up twice. Here's how it would land, like an airplane. It would even pop a little parachute out the back. They were burning through their brakes trying to stop it, so they popped out a little parachute. But very expensive and very dangerous, and it couldn't go up very high to orbit. In 1986, the first shuttle exploded on the way up because the one of those solid Roman candle boosters, I call it, one of those solid boosters leaked and the fire came out the side, went into that fuel tank. It's like lighting a cigarette lighter under the Hindenburg and watching what happens. The whole thing exploded, the shuttle exploded and all that. They fixed that problem, and then a few years later, that was in 1986, in January of 86. It happened because it was too cold to launch, and they launched anyway. And the pipes couldn't expand, the tubes couldn't expand properly, and the fuel leaked out and caused an explosion. So they fixed that problem. Mainly don't launch it in January when it's freezing cold. And then in 2003, I think, one of them had a hole in the wing, and they didn't know it, and it stayed up for a week with no problem. And then when it started to come back through the atmosphere, the superheated gases went into that hole in the wing and caused the shuttle to disintegrate and rain down over Texas and Louisiana. Very depressing. So 2 shuttles exploded. Finally, President Obama ordered them retired, and today they're in museums. The 3 that are left. We had 5. 2 of them blew up. The other 3 are in museums. We built a space station, which is still up there, and we use, I think, Russian rockets to get to it now, but they're working on the SpaceX being able to go. There's the Hubble telescope, so we could take great pictures without the Earth's atmosphere and pollution in the way. Pictures like that. We've sent robots like Voyager 1 and 2 off to Jupiter and Saturn. Now, in fact, Voyager 1 and 2 are going so fast, they're outside the solar system now. They're going 20,000 miles an hour. They're the fastest objects ever created by man. There's Voyager. And we've put little robots on Mars. The first one just sat there and flipped off Mars, but the ones since then have had little wheels and run around sampling and taking pictures of Mars. So beginning in 76, we've got robots on Mars. The Martians think it's a horrible robot invasion like Terminator. I'm kidding. And there's the Viking digging in the ground. And then we're talking about new plans to go to Mars, maybe, to build a moon base. There was the Orion program. There's the relative size, the Apollo moon rocket, the shuttle, and then the ones they've worked on recently. All right. So that gets us to the end. So with a couple of minutes to spare. So I'll just have 2 or 3 questions about the space program probably on your final. That section before it, though, America 45 to 60 is pretty important. Next week, we will look at from Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy through Vietnam and maybe into the 60s. And then on our final video session in 2 weeks from now, we will look at like the 70s, 80s, 90s up to the present, including Watergate and Vietnam, and I guess we'll already have done Vietnam, stuff like that. So, all right, send me an email if you have any questions about anything. Otherwise, I'll have your first video quiz posted probably this week sometime, but your test on World War II through Korea should go up in about 5 minutes from this time I'm recording this, at about 11 o'clock on Monday. It's just a short multiple choice test. You have through midnight next Monday. All right, good luck with it, and keep an eye out for more announcements and stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.